I built a construction supply empire from a rusted-out pickup truck and a stack of unpaid invoices. I survived 2 recessions, a hostile buyout attempt, and a business partner who tried to forge my signature on a loan. But none of that prepared me for the betrayal that nearly killed me twice, once in my chest and once in my heart. I was lying on a gurney, gasping through an oxygen mask, when I heard my own wife tell the doctor she'd call him back after her flight landed. If you want to know what a man does when he realizes the woman he trusted for 22 years valued a beach resort more than his last breath, stay with me. Because this really happened. And I promise you the ending is worth it. My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. On a gray Thursday morning in November, I was standing in the loading yard of my own supply company outside Denver, checking a shipment of steel rebar against a manifest, when the pain hit. It didn't announce itself politely. It came on like a truck backing into my chest, pinning me against the cold morning air. I dropped the clipboard. My foreman, Miguel, caught me before my knees buckled completely, and the last thing I remember clearly was the sound of my own boots scraping uselessly against gravel as he lowered me down and screamed for someone to call 911. The next hour was fragments, sirens, a stranger's hands tearing my jacket open, a needle, the hard plastic of a backboard against my spine. I'd built cross-county supply from nothing, from a truck with a cracked windshield and a handwritten ledger, into a company that supplied half the contractors in 3 counties. I had calculated risk my entire adult life, priced it, hedged it, planned around it, and lying in that ambulance, staring at fluorescent lights strobing past the window, I understood with total clarity that this was the one risk I couldn't outnegotiate. My heart was failing, and there wasn't a single contract in the world that could fix it. At the hospital, they wheeled me into a trauma bay full of shouting and machinery. A doctor with kind eyes and an exhausted voice leaned over me and told me I was having a serious cardiac event, that they needed to get me stable and move fast. He asked for an emergency contact. I gave him my wife's name, Diane, 22 years married. I pictured her hearing the words heart attack and dropping everything, her coffee, her plans, her entire day, and running out the door still in her socks. The doctor dialed her number and put it on speaker, I think because he wanted me to hear something comforting before they put me under. It rang. Once. Twice. Then her voice, bright and distracted, background noise behind her, the clatter of a suitcase being zipped, the low hum of a television. Diane, the doctor said, his voice steady and clinical. This is Dr. Alvarez, calling from St. Josephine Medical Center. I'm here with your husband, Walter. He's suffered a serious heart attack, and his condition is unstable. We need you to come in as soon as you possibly can. There was a pause. Not the gasp I expected, not the sound of her chair scraping back, just a long, irritated exhale, the kind you'd give a telemarketer. Is this some kind of scam call? She said. The doctor blinked, clearly thrown. No, ma'am, this isn't a scam. Your husband is in critical condition. We need his family here. I can't just drop everything right now, she said, and I heard the zipper again, that awful metallic hiss. Marcus and I have been planning this trip for 8 months. We leave for Cabo in 4 hours. Our flights are non-refundable, first class, the whole thing. You know how hard it is to get a suite at that resort in November? The doctor's eyes found mine. I couldn't speak. There was a tube down my throat by then. But if I could have, I don't know what I would have said. Ma'am, your husband may not survive the night, he told her, and I watched his jaw tighten with something between disbelief and disgust. Just give him something for the pain, Diane said, breezy, like she was talking about a headache. He's tough. He's survived worse. I am not losing 8 months of planning over this. Tell him to call me when he's stable. The line went dead. The machine beside me screamed a rhythm I didn't recognize as my own heartbeat anymore. And somewhere underneath the panic and the crushing weight in my chest, something else ignited, cold, slow, and absolutely certain. If I lived through this night, Diane was going to come home from that resort to find that her entire world had quietly disappeared while she was gone. I want to explain who Marcus was, because he matters. Marcus was my stepson, Diane's boy from her first marriage. I took him in when he was 19, gave him a job in my company sweeping the warehouse floor, and over the years I promoted him past every honest employee I had until he was sitting in an office with his name on the door, Vice President of Operations. I told myself I was building a legacy for my family. I didn't understand yet that I was handing a knife to someone who'd been sharpening it against my back for a decade. 3 days later, Once they'd moved me out of the ICU and into a private recovery room, the door opened, and in walked Diane and Marcus. She was tan. Freshly tan, the kind you don't get from a Colorado November, the kind you get from 4 days on a beach in Mexico. She was carrying a new leather bag I'd never seen, and Marcus wore a suit that fit him better than any suit had any business fitting a man who used to smell like diesel and sawdust. "Walter, honey," Diane said, leaning over the bed rail, her voice syrup-sweet and completely hollow. "You look so much better. The doctors said you're out of the woods." I didn't answer right away. I studied her face for something real. Fear, guilt, relief, anything. All I found was impatience, the same look she used to give slow cashiers. Marcus stood at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, glancing at the monitors like they were quarterly reports. "We didn't want to overwhelm you with visitors," he said, "but we figured you'd want to know the business is running smoothly. I've got everything handled." "You should rest," Diane said, patting my hand and then pulling hers back fast, like she'd touched something unpleasant. "Marcus has really stepped up. You should be proud. You always taught him the value of hard work." I let my eyes go slack. I let my hand tremble a little more than it needed to. 40 years of negotiating with contractors who'd cut your throat over a nickel. A square foot teaches you how to read a room, and it teaches you how to hide exactly what you're thinking behind a mask of confusion. I nodded slowly, the obedient, foggy old man they wanted to see. That's when Marcus reached into his jacket and produced a folder of papers, crisp and heavy. "It's just a formality, Walter," he said, uncapping a pen. "Power of attorney, temporary, just so I can keep signing off on vendor contracts and payroll while you recover. The bank's been asking for it. Nothing major." I looked at the papers. My chest ached, but my mind was doing what it had always done best, running numbers, spotting the trap hidden inside the fine print. And there it was, buried in a clause on the second page, dressed up in legal language dense enough to make a tired man's eyes glaze over. Full authority to liquidate business assets and transfer ownership stakes. That wasn't payroll. That was the deed to my entire company, wrapped in a bow and handed to me to sign while I was still hooked up to a heart monitor. I let my hand shake as I took the pen. My real signature had a distinctive slash through the W, a habit from 40 years of signing my name on contracts worth more than most people's houses. I dragged the pen across that dotted line in a jagged, meaningless scrawl, deliberately butchering it, making it look exactly like the signature of a man whose brain had been starved of oxygen for 90 seconds too long. Any forensic document examiner worth their fee would flag that signature as invalid inside of 5 minutes. Marcus snatched the papers the second the ink dried, not even glancing at it twice, folding it into his jacket like he'd just closed the biggest deal of his life. "Thanks, Walter," he said, that old sweetness curdled now into something smug. "This is going to make everything so much easier." Diane leaned down, kissed my forehead dry, mechanical, over before it started, and told me they'd call when I was discharged, that they needed to beat traffic getting back to the airport for a connecting flight to finish out the trip. And then they were gone, her heels clicking down the hallway, fading into nothing. And I lay there in the sudden silence, counting to 60 in my head, just to be sure. Then I sat up. My chest still ached like a fist was resting on it, but my mind was perfectly clear. I reached for the tablet in my hospital bag, the one Miguel had brought from the yard along with a change of clothes, and I logged into the joint bank account Diane had access to. I told myself I was prepared for anything: resort charges, spa treatments, a few extra cocktails on my dime. I was not prepared for the first line item. A charge from a boutique inside the Denver airport, made 90 minutes after the hospital called her. $11,000. Designer luggage and a handbag. The next line item, 30 minutes later, a deposit to a private catamaran charter in Cabo, San Lucas. $6,000. This wasn't a grieving wife scrambling to process bad news. This was a woman shopping for a celebration. I closed that account and opened the company's corporate ledger, and that's when I found the wire transfer sitting in the pending queue, $42,000, routed to a firm called Prescott and Ames. I knew that name. Every business owner in Denver knew that name. Prescott and Ames didn't do vendor contracts. They did hostile liquidations. They did forced asset sales for companies about to be gutted and sold off in pieces. Marcus hadn't just taken temporary authority to keep the lights on. He'd hired a firm whose entire business model was tearing companies apart and selling the bones. I needed eyes I could trust inside that building. someone who wouldn't run straight to Marcus the second I made a move. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the one name that mattered: Rosa Delgado, my office manager for 18 years. The woman who'd kept the books straight through 2 recessions and 1 attempted embezzlement by a previous partner. She'd started as a receptionist, answering phones in a room that smelled like motor oil and cheap coffee, and she'd earned every ounce of trust I had left in this world. I called her. She picked up on the second ring, breathless. "Walter, oh my God," I heard. "I was about to drive to the hospital right now." "Don't," I said. "Sit down at your desk. Log into the finance terminal. I need you there, not here." There was a pause, and then her voice changed, sharpened, the way it always did when something was wrong at the yard. "What's going on?" "Marcus locked me out of my own authorization level an hour after visiting me in recovery," I said. "He got me to sign what he called a temporary power of attorney. There's a liquidation clause buried in it, and he just wired $42,000 to Prescott and Ames." I heard her breath catch. Even from the front desk, everyone in that industry knew what that firm meant. "Walter, that doesn't make sense. He doesn't have the authority to engage outside counsel like that without board sign-off." "He does now," I said. "On paper. Except the signature on that paper isn't mine." "Not really. I need you to pull every financial record from the last 6 months before he thinks to cover his tracks. Payroll discrepancies, vendor overcharges, anything that doesn't add up, and I need you to do it quietly. For the next 4 days, while the hospital thought I was a docile, recovering old man shuffling around in a robe, Rosa and I built a case. She found it fast. Marcus had been quietly overbilling 3 fictitious vendors for the better part of a year, routing payments through shell companies that traced back to an account with his name on it. Nearly $300,000, bled out slowly enough that nobody would notice until the annual audit, if they noticed at all. He wasn't just planning to inherit my company early. He'd been robbing it blind while waiting for the inheritance to become official. I also learned something else, something that hollowed me out more than the fraud did. Rosa found the original engagement letter Marcus had signed with Prescott and Ames, and the date on it was 6 weeks before my heart attack. 6 weeks. This wasn't a man who saw an opportunity in my hospital bed. This was a man who'd already decided I was worth more dead than alive, long before my heart ever gave him the excuse. I was discharged 11 days after the attack, and I told everyone, Diane, Marcus, the hospital staff, that I needed quiet time at the house to recover before returning to work. Diane barely looked up from her phone when I came home. She and Marcus had extended the Cabo trip twice by then, coming home with sunburns and shopping bags, acting like a man who almost died was a minor inconvenience they'd already filed away. I spent those quiet weeks doing the opposite of resting. I met with my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Vance, in a coffee shop 40 minutes outside the city, where nobody would recognize either of us. I had her draft an emergency board resolution reversing the fraudulent power of attorney on the grounds of a forged signature, supported by 3 independent handwriting experts. I had her prepare documentation for the district attorney's office covering the embezzlement, the shell companies, and the falsified vendor invoices. And I had her draw up a new will, one that erased Diane and Marcus from every line of it. 2 weeks after I came home, I invited them both to the house for dinner. I told Diane I wanted to celebrate my recovery as a family. She actually smiled at that, the first real expression I'd seen from her in months, and I understood in that moment that she thought the danger had passed, that the old fool had survived and forgiven and forgotten, exactly like always. They arrived at 7. I'd asked Rosa and Patricia to wait quietly in the study with the documents. I'd asked 2 off-duty sheriff's deputies I knew personally, moonlighting as security, to wait outside near the garage. Diane wore a new dress. Marcus wore a new watch. They sat down at my table, in my house, built by my hands, and Diane raised a glass of wine and said, "To new beginnings." I didn't raise my glass. I set down my fork and I said, "Let's talk about Prescott and Ames." I watched the color drain out of both of their faces in real time. Marcus's hand froze halfway to his wine glass. Diane's smile cracked at the edges like old paint. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said. "Too fast, too high. You signed the engagement letter 6 weeks before my heart attack," I said. "Rosa has it, along with $300,000 in fraudulent vendor payments routed through shell companies with your name buried in the paperwork. And Diane $11,000 at an airport boutique, 90 minutes after a doctor told you I might not survive the night. I have the bank statements. I have the timeline. I have all of it. Diane's face went white, then red. Walter, you don't understand. It was already booked. We couldn't just— You could have come to the hospital, I said, keeping my voice level. The same voice I used to close deals worth millions. You chose a catamaran instead. I nodded toward the study door, and Patricia walked out with the folder, and Rosa walked out behind her, and the two deputies stepped in from the hallway I'd left unlocked. Marcus stood up so fast his chair clattered backward. This is insane. You can't just— I can, I said. The board already voted to reverse the power of attorney on the basis of forgery. The district attorney's office already has the fraud documentation, and as of this morning, both of you are removed from my will entirely. Diane started crying, the kind of crying that comes fast and loud when someone realizes performance won't save them anymore. 22 years, Walter. 22 years, and this is what you do to me? You did this to yourself the day you told a doctor to give me a pill so you wouldn't miss a flight, I said. I just made sure you couldn't do it to anyone else. The deputies escorted Marcus out first, informing him of the pending charges as they walked him to the car waiting in my driveway. Diane followed a few minutes later, still sobbing, clutching a coat that wasn't even hers, one of the new ones from the Cabo trip. I stood on my own porch in the cold November air and watched the taillights disappear down the road, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not joy, exactly. Something steadier than that. Relief, maybe, at finally seeing clearly. 6 weeks later, Marcus was formally charged with wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Without access to my money for a defense attorney, he ended up with an overworked public defender and a plea deal that still carries a mandatory 8 years in a federal facility. The company he tried to help gut is thriving. The shell company payments were recovered in full, and Rosa Delgado sits in the office that used to have his name on the door, except now it has hers, along with a partnership stake she earned 100 times over during 18 years of loyalty I nearly took for granted. Diane's story ended differently, though just as predictably. Our prenuptial agreement had an infidelity and fraud clause I'd almost forgotten existed, drafted back when I was still cautious enough to protect myself before love made me careless. It voided her claim to nearly everything. Last I heard, she's renting a one-bedroom apartment on the far side of town and working the counter at a home goods store, folding towels for customers who have no idea she once wore a new handbag while her husband's heart monitor screamed in a hospital hallway. I don't tell you this story looking for pity, friend. And I'm not telling it to celebrate cruelty either. I'm telling it because I spent 22 years believing that giving people everything was the same thing as loving them, and it took a heart attack to show me the difference. Real love doesn't check its watch while you're dying. Real loyalty doesn't need a forged signature to prove itself. It shows up, unasked, the moment you need it most, just like Rosa did. I rebuilt my will around the people who actually earned it. My employees, a scholarship fund for kids from neighborhoods like the one I grew up in, and a woman who picked up the phone on the second ring instead of packing a suitcase. My heart is stronger now than it's been in a decade, and for the first time in a long while, so is everything else.